I didn't like the original Turnip Boy game, so what am I doing reviewing its sequel? Honestly, I don't know. I heard the game was a few hours long, and I was bored one Saturday afternoon. Thank you, Game Pass. Very cool. This time, instead of ripping off Zelda, we're ripping off roguelite twin-stick shooters, and it's a bank robbery. How fun. So did this game have a better impression on me than the first? Let's talk about it. Now, looking back at my original Turnip Boy review, the biggest issue I had with it was its writing. The game was barely 2 hours long, and it only was able to carry itself that far on a ton of video game and meme references. The gameplay itself was actually fine. It was just this main shtick of its dialogue that really got boring pretty quickly for me. I'm happy to say that in Turnip Boy Robs a Bank, the writers have moved away from the endless memes and instead focus more on world building, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. This is a game about sentient vegetables. And they do all this while still maintaining the same irreverent tone and style of the first game. There's a lot of returning characters that you find as you explore the bank, and thankfully they tell you that they're returning characters, because personally I would not have remembered at all. At its heart, this is still a comedy game. It's still comedy writing, but it actually feels like there's plot this time, story, even motivations for the various characters that will have you exploring the bank as they ask you to retrieve whatever MacGuffin item that they need for their particular side quest. On the gameplay side, it is a roguelike at heart, but it actually has a lot more structure than most games in the genre do. The bank layout at a high level really does not change from run to run. It's always the same. However, throughout the bank, there are a number of elevators that you can take that do take you into randomly generated rooms. The rooms themselves are actually static. There's about 15 or so of them. So the room itself might not change, it's just which of the 15 that elevator takes you to. That's where the randomness comes into play on your runs in this game. Most of these rooms are small, but have either characters that will give you side quests or items that are needed for side quests. This actually turns it into kind of a positive that there's not an overwhelming number of rooms that you could run into, because if you are trying to complete a specific mission, side quest for example, it would be pretty frustrating to go like 10-20 runs without finding the room that you needed to find. However, this kind of also works against the game, since there really isn't quite enough side content to sustain the main game's narrative. I found that I was pretty much done with all the side stuff while still being about maybe 3/4 of the way through the main narrative as far as my runs were concerned. The actual gameplay is a twin-stick shooter. You move with one stick, you aim and fire with the other. You start with basic guns, a pistol, a shotgun, but as you progress in runs, you can pick up new and unique weapons from enemies, or even from some of those random elevator rooms. But these have limited ammo. If you survive your run, you can bring back the guns that you pick up, and actually use them to research your own weapons to broaden out your arsenal. This helps you unlock more powerful starting weapons in theory. In practice, I found that the shotgun was the best starting weapon, and there was no point really taking any other starting weapon. Seeing as you're robbing a bank, you're going to come out of these runs with a lot of money, and you can use that money to upgrade Turnip Boy himself. You also need it to buy items that will be required to progress deeper into the bank. It's a nice little gameplay loop, and it definitely gives you that one more run feeling when you finish up. And the runs are short enough that it really doesn't feel too long to start a new one. Most of them maybe run like 10 to 15 minutes. The game does have a narrative and progression in its map as well. And here's where the game's pacing actually became a little spotty. Runs are quick, which is nice, but the game uses essentially checkpoints where you beat a boss, and so now you have access to a new area of the bank, or you unlocked a new item, and so now you can get through whatever's blocking you from getting into the next area. But whenever you hit these checkpoints, you are essentially forced to stop your current run, go back to the base to either see the cutscene that's required or buy the item that you can now afford to progress the story. And these stops were kind of jarring. I really would have liked if there was a smoother way to go about it. Especially early on in the game, you really can only collect a very small amount of money on each of your runs. So it felt like there was a lot of times where I was forced to just cut a run short because I had all the money I could carry. And so I felt like the game was forcing me to stop a run rather than letting it end naturally, which was a little annoying. The other big problem I had with the game comes at the very end, and I feel like I say this a lot. I don't know why games seem to have so much trouble with sort of a final boss and balancing it compared to the rest of the game. The final end of the game is not anything that you've been doing this entire time. Instead of doing a single run, you now have to do a boss rush mode, essentially, beating all of the game's previous bosses, as well as a new boss, and then do another gauntlet where you essentially race through the bank, and if you die at any point, of course, it resets your run. So now, you have what used to be a 5 to 10, maybe 15-minute run game. To beat it, you have to do at least 20-minute run, and if you fail at any point, you have to start over. It was really frustrating, and it was poorly balanced. Because you've progressed through the game, doing the boss rush is relatively easy. You've beaten these bosses before, you know how to beat them. Where you would normally fail would be on the second part. So not only is this a long run, it's also one that's easy to fail on that second part, and one that you have to take like 10 to 15 minutes to even get to. So when you fail, you got to go through all this other stuff that is mostly mindless, basic, and easy by comparison, just to get to that end. I think it really would have benefited from a checkpoint system or something to alleviate some of that frustration. Now, luckily, if you don't want to deal with that, the game does have a lot of accessibility options, including invulnerability. So just make yourself invulnerable and do this last little bit, get it over with, see the ending. I don't think there's anything wrong with that if that's something you choose to do, because it can kind of feel like a waste of time to keep trying and doing all these runs. That said, I can understand that doing that would feel a little empty and unfulfilling at the end of a game that you've been playing that requires skill and all that, so I don't know. Overall, I enjoyed this game. It's short, it's sweet, it doesn't overstay its welcome, but it also doesn't feel too short. It's got mostly good progression, and in my eyes is the way a roguelike game should go, because it does have that story and progression. If it wasn't on Game Pass, I'm not sure that I would have paid for it, but it is kind of the perfect Game Pass game. Just one of those short games that you can blast through in a weekend that you have on the service, that you're happy to have gotten to experience, but you wouldn't have paid for normally. So for a final score, I give the presentation a 3 out of 5, the gameplay a 3.5 out of 5, the story a 2.5 out of 5, for an overall rating of 3.5 out of 5, with the value of Game Pass. Go play it on Game Pass. It's the perfect Game Pass game. But what do you think? Is this game a steal? Get it? Because he robs banks. Do you rob banks? Let me know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like the video, maybe subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all with the next video.